For this second tutorial video, you're going to need the same materials you did for the first, your watercolor paints, your brushes, and hopefully you should have one flat and one round, water, and then of course paper towels. So you've already drawn your crystal cluster. This one's a little bit different than the previous tutorial because we're actually going to be painting edge to edge. And it's very important to know what you're doing when you're doing wet on wet technique with that. Because if you wet your paper first with the water and you do the entire crystal at once, remember you're following the edges, applying the water so that it soaks in, but you don't want puddles. So if you have any standing water, you can just dab it with the paper towel. But if I do the entire crystal first, and then I go in and try to paint sections next to each other, that are still wet, you're gonna get colors bleeding at the edges, right? The water's gonna be drawn across that line, and you're not gonna be able to maintain. You can see how the orange is starting to bleed into the yellow there. So as you choose your sections and you're working from lighter to darker colors in your painting, you want to skip around so that you're not painting one wet edge right against another wet edge. Other than that, the technique's very similar to the previous video, right? You're going to apply lightest colors first. You want to stay away from complementary colors, right? Because if I paint a yellow and then try to put purple inside of that, you're going to get ugly brown and neutral colors that you're not wanting. The other thing you'll notice is when you're using a flat brush, notice how I'll use the straight edge or the edge of the bristles on the side to follow those straight edges, right? The bristles should always follow the handle, right? We're not pushing, we're not going in a circular motion. When you get into smaller sections, you can go to that pointed brush tip. And it's not a lot of back and forth, right? If you are brushing to the point that you're getting the pulp of the paper starting to come off, you're using the brush too much, right? We're really just kind of touching the surface and letting the paper do the work and absorb a lot of that. There shouldn't be any visible brush strokes. If you're getting brush strokes, then your paper's too dry, right? Or your watercolor is too thick. So once you've got your light colors down, this is when we can start making, or while they're still wet, you can start making other colors. So if I want to make an orange inside that section there, right, I can go in and dab into it with a little bit of red and let that kind of fill in. If it starts to go places you don't want it to go, take your paper towel and touch it. Another technique, if you want a blotted effect, is to wad up your paper towel, and that'll give it a starburst pattern in there. So if you're wanting that bleed look in there, right, you're doing fresh sections. where that base yellow is still wet. Now in some sections you may want to add what looks like a shadow. So those are the ones, some of the first ones you do. They're still a little damp. If they're too dry, you can go back in and add that edge. But if you want more control of the second color on top, you're going to give time between the layers. And sometimes it helps to blot your brush before you apply it back onto the paper. So this gives me a little bit more control. If I want to fade that edge, I'm gonna get some clean water and use the clean water as a blender. I like using the flat brushes on larger areas just because it's easier to follow that straight edge. And I can add that shaded side down that plane, get some clean water, clean that up there. So this is an activity where you get to experiment with some different effects, right? You can go back in and add different shades of your base before adding different colors. But if you're going to start with a warm color, stay in the warm side of the color wheel. Kind of pay attention to where you are, like the direction you're going in it. So you're going to work your way back through it over and over again. There may be sides, and typically the front larger sections are lighter than the bottoms or smaller outer sections. So if you want any areas that are white, you're actually going to paint around those with your brush. So I'll start an edge. I'll get some clean water. I'm going to leave a white highlight there. I'm going to do the same thing over here in this one. So there's basically 3 effects that you're trying to gain in this exercise, right? Try to have some sections with some white highlighted areas and practice painting around those highlights and picturing what those are going to look like in your head as you add them. You're going to practice that wet on wet effect where you get that kind of fade and bleed and letting the water do the work. And then you're doing a wet on wet where you're showing contour, the angle of the bevel. By letting the first layer dry a little bit. And then going back in and adding those shadows along the edges with the edge of your brush. And then fading that in. Now when you're done, you should be able to pick up your your painting, right? Or peel the tape off. And again, you don't have to have it taped to the table. This is sketchbook paper anyway, so it's gonna wrinkle a little bit. Once it's completely dry, if you want to get rid of that wrinkle, you can just press the paper between the two books, between two books or inside the pages of a book. When you're done, and it's completely dry, you'll take a photo of this and your first exercise and turn those in both into Canvas. If you apply paint that's too dark, right, you'll never get the color completely out of it. But if you want to go back in with some fresh water and then take your paper towel and dab it, it will lighten it up. And then you can let that dry a little bit and rework it if you want. So you do have some time with this wet on wet technique to kind of correct some mistakes or change some effects if you want. So have some fun with it.